Members will recall that in paragraph 14 of its resolution ES 10/21 of 27th October 2023, the Assembly decided to adjourn the 10th emergency special session temporarily and to authorize the President of the General Assembly at its most recent session to resume its meeting upon request from member states. In this regard, I should like to draw the attention of delegations to document A/ES 10/974, which contains a letter dated 8th December 2023 from the permanent representatives of Egypt and Mauritania to the United Nations in their respective capacities as chair of the Arab Group and Organization for Islamic Cooperation Group, requesting the resumption of the 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly. I intend to conduct the proceedings of this meeting in accordance with the rules of procedure of the General Assembly and the past practices of its emergency special sessions. The General Assembly will now resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Illegal Israeli Actions in Occupied East Jerusalem and the Rest of the Occupied Palestinian Territory. In this connection, the Assembly has before it draft resolution in document A/ES 10/L27 and draft amendments A/ES 10/L28 and A/ES 10/L29. The President will now deliver a statement. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, this past week, it was with a very heavy heart that I read the letter addressed to me by UNRWA Commissioner General Philip Lazzarini. That letter, on which many of your missions were also copied, highlighted the devastating deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. As Commissioner General Lazzarini himself predicted in his letter, the situation has since deteriorated further. Right now, what we are seeing is an onslaught on civilians, the breakdown of humanitarian systems, and profound disrespect for both international law and international humanitarian law. As I said before, even war has rules, and it is imperative that we prevent any deviation from these principles and values, the validity of which resides in their universal application. Tens of thousands have been killed, almost 70% of them women and children. Even more have been forcibly displaced by the incessant violence, with nowhere, I repeat, nowhere safe to go. And the targeting of hospitals schools, and UN-provided shelters, now so overcrowded that they have ceased to function as safe havens, continues unabated. All the while, the blockade on humanitarian assistance has made the delivery of urgently needed life-saving aid near impossible. Excellencies, clearly, what we are witnessing is the unprecedented collapse of an already crumbling humanitarian system in real time. It is incumbent upon us, as the United Nations, to bring an immediate end to the suffering of innocent civilians, the mounting death toll of those who are not, I repeat, are not combatants in this war, and to this untenable humanitarian catastrophe. Thanks to several countries' relentless efforts, a temporary humanitarian truce enabled the release of hostages, the freeing of detainees, and the delivery of some aid. However, since the 1st of December, we are witnessing the resumption of violence with a kind of ferocity that one asks, what more next? Civilians should never undergo the level of suffering we are currently witnessing. And again, I ask, how many more thousands of lives must be lost before we do something? No more time is left. The carnage must stop. For as long as this violence persists, a political solution to this conflict will continue to be undermined. The longer it takes, the higher the risk that a negotiated two-state solution will increasingly become out of reach. So the fact of the matter is, quite simply, the violence must stop. It must. I therefore once again add my voice to the demand of for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We have one singular priority, only one: to save lives. Excellencies, casting our gaze towards the future, we must assess the situation with honesty in our hearts, truth in our words, and a commitment to peace as our utmost ambition. A ceasefire is the only realistic first step towards de-escalating tensions. How can we possibly listen to each other over the deafening thundering of bombs? On 26th October, you gathered in this chamber with the membership resoundingly and unequivocally calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. On December 7th, once more, a veto was cast in the Security Council. Once again, this emergency special session has been resumed. We certainly cannot continue in this way without even the possibility, let alone the prospect, for a meaningful solution. As President of the General Assembly, I am committed to supporting any and all efforts to put an end to the bloodshed and the psychological torture of the people in Gaza. I used my recent attendance at the Doha Forum and every other platform I can to encourage cooperation among states with the same singular goal in mind: to make peace for all. In the name of humanity, I ask you all once again, stop this violence now. I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt to introduce draft resolution A/ES 10/L27.
Sayyid Rais.
Mr. President, I thank you on behalf of the Arab Group for quickly heeding our call to hold this meeting. The call from the Arab and Islamic groups in an attempt to overcome the obstruction of the Security Council's attempts to shoulder its responsibilities by calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in the occupied Palestinian territory. There was an extensive use of the veto against the humanitarian ceasefire draft resolution, even though it was supported by more than 100 member states within a few hours in the United Nations. This is a sign that the majority of the international community is well aware of the seriousness of the current situation and its repercussions, its tragic repercussions on international peace and security. Mr. President, the draft resolution tabled today, A/ES 10/L27, is very simple, clear, and explicit. It only includes 4 operative paragraphs. However, the implementation of these paragraphs has yet to happen by the international community for 2 months. Even though the tragic humanitarian situation is unbearable for the Palestinians, they are subjected to barbaric attacks by Israeli occupation forces against civilians in Gaza. This has led to an unbearable humanitarian suffering. It has threatened international peace and security. This is why the Secretary General of the United Nations, and for the first time since he took office and for several decades, decided to invoke Article 99 of the UN Charter to call specifically for what this draft resolution is calling for, namely a humanitarian ceasefire. Because the Israeli aggression destroyed the health system, there are concerns of a demise of the public order and the humanitarian support system in Gaza. It is impossible to provide humanitarian assistance there, and this is why the Commissioner General of UNRWA spoke to you and sent you a letter to shed light on the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza and its impact on UNRWA's capacity to shoulder its mandate and how it affects the safety and security of UNRWA staff. Mr. President, the Arab Group stresses that the efforts by a minority of states that are standing against international public opinion, which is calling for a ceasefire, are using void pretexts and justifications in saying that Israel has the right to defend itself. This is a deliberate sign. And we would like to say that this right does not apply to Israel because it is the occupying power. It's occupying the occupied Palestinian territories. And this right does not absolve Israel from committing to the implementation of international law and protecting innocent civilians, women, and children during wars. These tragic attempts are a despicable sign of double standards. Some countries are calling for stopping the aggression, stopping the war, stopping the occupation, and stopping attacks on civilians, and for respecting the international humanitarian law and international law in specific cases. However, and unfortunately and shamelessly, they turn their back to these calls in other situations, especially when they're related to Palestinians and their right to live in security on their territory, in their independent state, to stop the war crimes against Palestinians. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the adoption and the implementation of the draft resolution by the General Assembly today, which is specifically calling for a ceasefire, is the only guarantee for saving innocent civilians. Paragraph 6 of the preamble is very balanced and neutral, despite what some might claim. It stresses the need for protecting civilians from both sides in line with the international humanitarian law. The draft resolution is calling in its operative paragraphs upon all parties to commit to the protection of civilians and the release of all hostages and to ensure humanitarian access. Mr. President, the perpetration of this destructive war will lead to a full-fledged catastrophe. This will unfortunately mean that genocide will be used as a tool for war, completely disregarding international law. This will lead the region to a full-fledged war, and it will jeopardize the credibility of this international organization. Mr. President, the Arab Group calls upon all member states to support the draft resolution before you today, to prevent any double standards and to protect international values, to support collective interests, and to protect international peace and security. We also call upon all delegations to vote against any amendments proposed, because they were not discussed with the sponsor countries. This is to protect the balance of the text. The text was drafted so as to go in line with the draft resolution tabled at the Security Council to achieve the main priority, the number one priority, a very clear and specific objective, namely a humanitarian ceasefire. Let us not confuse things, because some delegations have proposed amendments, whereas they voted against the draft resolution at the General Assembly that was adopted last year. In this emergency special session, which called for a humanitarian pause that will eventually lead to a cessation of hostilities. This unveils the true objective behind these amendments, namely the continuation of the aggression and the bloodshed. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, what are we all waiting for to stop this fire? What are we waiting for to end this zero-sum war? What are we waiting for to stop the killing and stop the destructive war machine? Can we wait? Can we even wait when the number of civilians killed has gone beyond 18,000 including more than 7,000 children, with one child dying every 10 minutes? And when the number of the injured has exceeded 49,000 people? Excellencies, I am speaking to you, to your conscience today. I am calling upon you to support the draft resolution to stop the bloodshed.
Honorable President, I sincerely ask you, Mr. President, to suspend the debate following the introductions to proceed to take action on the draft resolution A/ES/10/L25 without delay, given the urgency of the situation on the ground and the importance of a global call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, with the understanding that the debate would resume immediately after action and the adoption of the resolution, and that emergency session 10 would only be temporarily adjourned after the conclusion of the debate. And I do thank you, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative